Executive Vice President, National Security and Defense, AFCEA International.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, welcome to our second plenary panel session with China as a pacing threat. What are the key opportunities and challenges? Those are some big questions. And we have a very large panel here, well, ready to answer a lot of those questions. And I'll keep this brief because there's a lot to talk about here today, but I do have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for today's panel, Admiral Scott Swift, United States Navy retired. Admiral Swift is no stranger to this area. He attended San Diego State University and received his commission through the Aviation Reserve Officer Candidate Program and became a Navy Light Attack Strike Fighter pilot. He served almost 40 years and commanded at all levels, culminating in his assignment as commander of the Pacific Fleet. He brings a wealth of operational experience, participating in several combat operations, and deep knowledge and understanding of the Pacific region with his many assignments there. And Admiral Swift continues to explore opportunities to contribute. He founded the Swift Group. He's a research affiliate with MIT, a senior fellow at the Center for Naval Analysis, and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and a member of the board of the U.S. Naval Institute. So, sir, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
All right, usually it's not a good thing to follow lunch, but I don't think it's going to be a problem today. So we've got a problem here in the second row. No one asked questions, and actually, you're the only one that can't ask questions in the second row. Admiral Gortney, my good friend and nemesis. As you can tell from the introduction and the panelists that you see up here today, it's really quite extraordinary. I'm just going to ripple fire down the line, not that anybody would not know who these individuals are. And you can refer to your program for their more in-depth bio, but from my left is Vice Admiral Boyle, the 3rd Fleet Commander, Lieutenant General Smith, the 1 MEF Commander, and we've got them seated in proximity to each other as they share the same battle space. Vice Admiral Thomas from 7th Fleet, Lieutenant General Bierman from 3 MEF, Vice Admiral Tianson, who commands the entire Pacific as the Area Coast Guard Commander up in Alameda, Vice Admiral Dwyer from 2nd Fleet, and Vice Admiral Clapperton from 10th Fleet, who of course commands the globe from a cyber perspective. I'm going to share some very short comments up front, and then we're going to turn it over to the panelists and give them 5 minutes each to share their perspective of the challenges that's been presented to them by the subject here today. We're going to have a dialogue after that. They share their thoughts, and then we're going to make sure we have at least 20 minutes for Q&A and what's on your mind. So I look forward to that discussion. As I was listening to Admiral Paparo's comments today, I jotted down a couple of thoughts that came to me as he was speaking. And that is certainly from a global perspective, not just a Pacific perspective, relevancy of force is optimized by embracing the operational tenets of mobility and expeditionary operations. And this is especially true if you don't have the luxury of preponderance of force and internal supply lines while your adversary does. A large part of the strategy needs to be focused on this expeditionary and mobility. And we're seeing that play out in real time in Ukraine compared to fighting a much larger force that has absolutely internal supply lines that the Ukrainians can't reach. And yet they're being very successful with the expeditionary and mobile approach that they're taking. And I think this is reflective in the tenets of distributed maritime operations blended with the tenets of expeditionary advance-based operations. A lot of people talk about and ask questions about those two elements and what do they mean. Well, I think you'll have a much better understanding after these gentlemen speak about what those tenets look like in application. So to be clear, the panel here is leading, planning, and operating at the tactical edge today. There's only 3 commanders who are not present, which is extraordinary. The 5th Fleet Commander, the 2nd MEF Commander, and the 6th Fleet Commander. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that 7th Fleet and 3 MEF are here today with everything that's going on in their part of the world. They are focused on deterring with the forces that they have, recognizing that if deterrence doesn't work, they will have to fight with that same force should that come to pass. Really interesting to me in closing, before I turn it over to Vice Admiral Boyle, Admiral Paparo's comment, you may have missed it, and that is that the fighting fleet, the fleet fighting force is the numbered fleet. And he can't speak for the Commandant and how he views the Marine Corps, but I know the Commandant feels the same way about the MEF commanders. So enough for me. Admiral Boyle, I'll turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Admiral Swift. Hey, so it's a little intimidating when the Admiral I was the EA for is standing next to me. So he's, I think it may have always been the other way, though he just didn't realize it. The Admiral who was my CO and grounded me a few years back is sitting in the 2nd row. He doesn't remember the details correctly, so just ask me and I'll fill you in.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
And the Admiral that is my current boss was the speaker before me at lunch, so I'm going to try to, while talking about the pacing threat China, keep it at the unclassified level and not get in trouble with any of my 3 former bosses. But I thought I'd start with just a little bit about what 3rd Fleet is, because for a lot of you who have been involved with the Navy for a long time, you might not know exactly what we do, because 3rd Fleet has evolved. I think it started in 2015 when Admiral Swift started the idea of 3rd Fleet Forward. We became a lot more operational, and now we're actually trying to put the operational processes into that operational design to make it work. But we're 68,000 folks, we're 100 ships, and we're about 400 aircraft that make up 3rd Fleet. Obviously, I'm the operational commander of the force here on the West Coast of the Naval Force. My friends, the SWO boss Roy Kitchener, the Air boss Kenny Weitzel, and Sub-PAC Jeff Jablon are the ones that train the force, but I ensure, I certify that the training that they received is the right training for them to go forward and do whatever Admiral Paparo would have them do through my friend here, KT Thomas, forward in the Pacific or elsewhere. So that's the first thing I do, is the certification. And we're finding that certification is not just about certifying a 1-star task force that is the Carrier Strike Group. It's about certifying that force to plug into the tactical 3-star command elements, which are 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet, or 3 MEF and 1 MEF when we're forward. So that's number one. Number two is DISCA, the Defense Support of Civil Authorities, is a mission that 3rd Fleet must be ready to do. So, you know, in my battle rhythm, I'm paying attention to floods up in Sacramento and earthquakes here in the West Coast, because no force is better at moving support ashore than the naval force. So working with George here and putting forces on board amphibious lift to get them ashore where we might not be able to do it through other means. Third is the Maritime Homeland Defense mission. As Admiral Gortney will tell you, he had a really big role, a lot of accountability, but not a lot of forces to execute the mission of Maritime Homeland Defense, because those forces on the West Coast are assigned to INDOPACOM and Admiral Aquilino. And so, if NORTHCOM sees a threat that might be coming our way, he has to articulate that threat, and then Admiral Aquilino will provide forces and potentially a C2 element to prosecute and to hold at risk any threat to the United States coming across the maritime approaches. So I have to be ready to be that C2 element, and I have to ensure that my forces are ready to do that mission. And then fourth is I am a 3-star command element that reports to a JTF in conflict. I think the JTF, as Admiral Paparo probably described at lunch, would be Pac Fleet, and underneath him he has maneuver elements in 7th Fleet, 3rd Fleet, 1 MEF, and 3 MEF. And then he is supported by the other joint components in the Pacific. So I can't just do that in an exercise, a tabletop exercise, and then expect to be ready to go in conflict. So I have to rehearse that routinely from commander's intent coming from Lung Aquilino all the way down to the shooters, that they understand where they're supposed to go, who they're supposed to check in with, what they're allowed to blow up, who's got target engagement authority, et cetera. So that's the thing that I think we have been lacking the most, is the rehearsal of that operational art as the 3rd Fleet element, and ensuring that strike groups are ready to go and ready to plug into 3-star numbered fleet tactical commands when they go forward. And I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Fonz. So Lieutenant General Smith, from the perspective of 2MEF and the work that you're doing on behalf of the Commandant, as well as to the command structure in the Pacific, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Admiral. And to be clear, it's 1 MEF, just
What did I say,
that
2MEF?
correction.
1 MEF.
but thanks, sir. An honor to be here with the fleet commanders, my fellow MEF commander, and Andy, our Coast Guard teammate, with whom we work very closely. 1 MEF stationed here, based here in Southern California and in Arizona. You know, we continue to increase our focus west of the international date line, having largely been focused in the Central Command AOR since 9/11. What this has done has enabled a 2 Marine Expeditionary Force focus for steady state campaigning in the Western Pacific, while supporting the Joint Forces' broader deterrence efforts in reassuring allies and partners in the region. Now, in broad terms, 1 MEF's focus has been in the southern portion of the Indo-PACOM AOR, beginning in Australia and working north to the Philippines, where 1 and 3 MEFs will converge later this spring in support of exercise Balakatan. This connection between 1 and 3 MEF is especially important for the Marine Corps in the Pacific, because it provides naval and joint force commanders a significant and flexible capability. And when I talk naval, I'm talking principally to the 7th Fleet commander here. Within 1 MEF, our foundational warfighting organization remains our existing combined arms Marine Air Ground Logistics task forces. As you have likely read in open source, our 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit is currently operating with the Nimitz Carrier Strike Group in the South China Sea. That's all I'll say about that, because I won't splash around in that pond, because they work for Admiral Thomas right now, so I'll pass that to him for any elaboration. But I will say this is a significant shift, because our West Coast MEUs have been regularly ordered to the Central Command AOR for the past 2 decades. So I will say it's great to have them stay in the Indo-PACOM for what looks like will be the entirety of the deployment. Fingers crossed. This year, 1 MEF also assumed responsibility for the Marine rotational deployment to Darwin, Australia, with a Marine Air Ground Task Force in order to continue that bilateral training and strengthen the relationship with our Australian partners, while also positioning what I would describe as a fight tonight MAGTF in Australia. We continue to explore all opportunities to position 1 MEF forces west of the IDL to support ally and partner reassurance, while providing the pacing threat a different look, as again we support the broader deterrence effort. As an example, last fall we deployed for the first time Marine Rotational Force Southeast Asia, built around the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit command element. The force conducted ally and partner engagements in the Philippines, Brunei, Indonesia, and Singapore. To be clear, this is not a substitute for an embarked Marine Expeditionary Unit in any way, shape, or form. The unfortunate reality is based on overall amphibious ship capacity, the gaps between our deployments off the West Coast for our West Coast MUs continue to expand. I simply have new command element capacity and capability that I'm going to bring to bear in support of Admiral Aquilino and Admiral Paparo's steady state campaigning. These rotational forces plus steady state engineering efforts throughout the second and first island chains serve to describe or to create what I describe as one MEF connective tissue in the region that supports that Indo-PACOM steady state campaigning effort. Ultimately, we want to be positioned to seamlessly transition from such steady state campaigning, competition, if you will, to crisis or conflict, and back again. At OneMEF, we continue to do a great deal of work on sensing and making sense of the environment, closing kill chains, preserving the ability to command and control in a contested information environment. With our 3rd Fleet Team, we continue to take the lessons learned from our annual exercise Steel Night, conducted off the coast of Southern California here and throughout the Southwest United States, to advance our ability to execute naval expeditionary command and control. And Fonz Boyle touched on that in his remarks. During this year's exercise, 1st Marine Division and ESG-3 continue to move beyond integration in the Maritime Operations Center, which is important, into full-scale naval warfighting by working through the details of communications networks, information flow, target acquisition and prosecution, and other tasks critical to fighting as a naval warfighting team. Of particular note, Steel Night demonstrated the ability to seamlessly change command and control architecture in stride and pass C2 from ship to shore and back multiple times between Navy and Marine commanders in order to prosecute maritime targets and enable fleet maneuver. All very important. However, as a Marine Air Ground Logistics Task Force commander, I would place equal emphasis on sustainment and the challenges of logistics in a contested and distributed maritime environment. Logistics remains the pacing function when you look at operations against the vast expanse of the Pacific. For a force based in the Southwest United States, our ability to mitigate the tyranny of distance will require us to thicken the logistics networks we would rely on heavily upon any transition from competition to conflict. At OneMEF, we are expending a lot of calories on that challenge. The development of logistics nodes and distribution as we move west of the international date line, new pre-positioning constructs, all need to be worked with ever-increasing urgency at all echelons. Time is not our friend in this regard. We must also work to bridge the gap from theater to operational and ultimately to tactical logistics, often referred to as the last tactical mile or the last logistical mile. To that end, we need to look at forward positioning of equipment and supplies at key shore-based locations in the 2nd and 1st island chains to augment our maritime pre-positioned assets. Then we must have a variety of distribution platforms ranging from unmanned air-delivered systems to our organic marine aviation to LSMs, or the light amphibious warship, in order to close that last logistical mile and deliver sustainment across the beach to the warfighter. Again, lots of work to be done on this front. Finally, we can have the best concepts, the ideal structures, and the right equipment. We can get everything else right, but it won't work without the ability to recruit, develop, and retain the right young men and women. At OneMEF, we are laser focused on supporting the recruiting efforts of Brigadier General Morris and his Western Recruiting Region team stationed here in San Diego, as well as retaining our best and brightest on our team. There's been a lot written about retention challenges across the Joint Force of late. I'm proud to report that for the first time in 20 years, the Marine Corps has made our aggregate retention mission 2 years in a row for both our first-term Marines and our career force Marines. Closer to home, OneMEF contributed over half of the first-term infantry Marines retention mission for the entire Marine Corps, closing this traditionally hard-to-fill MOS at the end of last month for all of 23. I remain convinced, amidst the aggressive equipment modernization efforts within our Corps, that at the end of the day, our asymmetric advantage remains the eye-watering talent and initiative of our young men and women, some of whom you saw in the awards luncheon that preceded this panel. I see it every day across the almost 50,000 Marine and Sailor MEF that I am so privileged to command. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Vice Admiral Thomas? It'll be hot.
It's working. It's on. There we go. Colorblind, can't see the green light. Admiral Swift, thank you. Every day your forward deployed naval forces that are out in 7th Fleet are in contact with our pacing threat, China. And I like to usually say the People's Republic of China because it's, quite frankly, that's the pacing threat that we're dealing with is the leadership of the great country of China. And every day we operate dynamically with our allies and partners, and there is really no substitute for presence. My boss, Admiral Paparo, did a pretty good job of laying out what the challenges are that we face out there in 7th Fleet, and with every challenge there is an opportunity. And so what I thought I'd do is I'd share with you some tangible examples of what the sailors, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, airmen, and soldiers are doing right now out in 7th Fleet. And so from your left to right, I'll start with Admiral Fonz Boyle's ships from 3rd Fleet. His ships and my ships are actively prosecuting and disrupting 4 PRC ships that are operating between Guam and Wake. And there is no line in the ocean between Fonz's AOR and my AOR, and we work as seamlessly as one team. And we're demonstrating our reach across every domain, whether it be the surface domain, the air domain, the undersea domain, space, or cyber, against those PRC vessels. And then George forces, as he mentioned, are out on the Makin Island operating with the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group in the South China Sea as an expeditionary strike force. We're integrating his F-35 Bravos with the F-18s off the Nimitz and the Hawkeyes, the Growlers, the mixed bag of rotary aircraft that we have between those two vessels. We're conducting integrated long-range fires and testing and rehearsing our ability to share information and share warfare command responsibilities among those two forces, right in the backyard in South China Sea, something that the PRC claims is their water. And after Makin Island is done, working with the USS Nimitz, she's going to head up to Cobra Gold to work with our ally Thailand and conduct an exercise with that very important force. And to my left, CHIPS 3 MEF forces are operating today off of the USS America and the Green Bay, and they're conducting Iron Fist with our Japanese allies, a maneuver and amphibious landing exercise to ensure that we shore up that capability of Japan and our forces to help defend that important ally. Further to the left, Vice Admiral Tongsen's Coast Guard cutter Kimball just pulled into southern Japan, and she's getting ready to work with all of our allies and partners in a very important mission that only the Coast Guard, quite frankly, can do with some of these other Coast Guards in the region. And he's going to do very important work in the illegal fisheries area. He's going to shore up some of those vessels you heard Admiral Paparo talking about in the Philippine archipelago, where the Chinese PAFM and Coast Guard are harassing the Philippine Coast Guard. We'll have our Coast Guard vessels go in and work with them to help improve their tactics, techniques, and procedures. I also have Admiral Dwyer up here on the stage with me. And, you know, I had to think for a little bit about this connection between Admiral Dwyer and what he's doing out in 7th Fleet, but in reality, Dozier does an awful lot of work with our NATO allies and partners, and they are sailing much more frequently over in the 7th Fleet AOR. We have 2 United Kingdom offshore patrol vessels that are out there permanently. And then I think you read in the news not too long ago, the United Kingdom's Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier came across with a NATO strike force and plugged into our carrier strike groups for a combined multinational carrier strike force exercise. And then at the end, Craig Clapperton's information warriors on every one of my ships, providing information warfare support, protecting our networks, and sensing the environment, and defending the very important information systems on our ships. So it goes, though, beyond just what the teams that are up here on the stage are doing. I'll give you an example of my last week. I was in South Korea conducting a ASW Commanders Conference with my counterpart, Vice Admiral Kim, talking about how we're going to integrate our undersea forces. And right from there, I went to Japan to go to Hokkaido with my counterpart, Vice Admiral Saito, and we talked to the JGSDF and the JASDF about the threat to the north of Hokkaido, the Russian threat that's not more than 15 miles off the coast of Hokkaido. And finally ended up my trip down in the Philippines with Rear Admiral David, where we had a staff talks and had our two staffs talking about the threat that they see every day and how we're going to share and defend that important ally. So what I hope you take out of this, as I sit between two awesome Marines, that it's a great team, just as the ACMAC said this morning. It is a naval team, and it is also a team with our allies and partners who every day are thinking about the environment the exact same way we are and understand the pacing threat the same way we do. And that pacing threat is pushing us that much closer together and allowing us to operate as one team. So I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, KT. Lieutenant General Bierman.
Hey, thanks, Admiral Smith, fellow panel members and guests. I'm glad to have the opportunity to be back on this side of the international date line and talk a little bit about how 3MEF is campaigning with the Joint Force and with allies in the Western Pacific and meet our operational responsibilities. A little bit of context up front, some of which has been talked to. 3MEF is a forward-deployed Marine Air Ground Task Force in the first island chain. We are one of a number of critical components of the U.S. Indo-PACOM stand-in force. All of you have a reasonable level of familiarity with what stand-in forces do. Stand-in forces operate across the competition continuum, not just in crisis, but in campaigning as the leading edge of a maritime defense in depth. As a stand-in force, 3MEF maintains an extraordinarily high level of readiness to project power onto key maritime terrain early in an escalating regional crisis, and then we are prepared to leverage that same terrain in support of the fleet, the Joint Force, and allies and partners. As the Assistant Commandant said this morning, among other things, we thicken kill webs, we sense and make sense, and we enable maneuverability. I'll say in this and in all things, we are fully integrated and partnered with the U.S. 7th Fleet. Glad to sit here with my battle buddy, KT Thomas. But I'll tell you, when I talk about that naval integration, that is far more than a bumper sticker or a PowerPoint slide. 2 years ago, some of my heroes, you all know them, Stacy Clarity, 3MEF, Bill Mers at 7th Fleet, they collaborated on a joint operating concept. You know, they paved the ground. Since then, over the course of several staff talks over the last year, KT Thomas and I have taken that to the next level. We actually have orchestrated what we called the first 10 steps in the initial opening gambit of a conflict. We have fully integrated the 3rd MEF and CTF 76 staff into CTF 76.3. They live together, work together, campaign together, plan together. And I'll also say, you know, General Smith made the comment this morning, got a little bit of a laugh. If we have to stand in, it's Marines, U.S. Marines and submarines. Last week, my first small planners were up at CTF 74. All of them around the map sheet talking how we can pitch in and enable that critical effort. I will mention it's been covered, but I want to double down on it. 3MEF is one of 2 MEFs that fall under Marine Forces Pacific. 3 MEF in the first island chain, 1 MEF in Southern California, but in everything we do, glad to also be up here with my old friend George Smith. 3 MEF and 1 MEF are teammates in a whole of MAR for a pack approach to meeting the challenges of the region and a rising PRC. That's steady state competition, that's exercises, that's operations, and that's in our plan to meet our overlapping operational commitments. We did an exercise or demonstration last week where we had 1 MEF Marines that fell in on 3 MEF gear seamlessly. My MLR is in the desert right now working out, and they fell in on 1 MEF gear. But given the threat, not to mention the inherent distance, time, space, and logistics factors, I'll say the full-time focus of 2 MEFs and 2 fleets in the Western Pacific, it's significant and it's overdue. The Marine Corps and Navy have a rich history in the Pacific. We've never left, but of late, we are truly doubling down our attention, our resourcing, and our focus. 3 MEF's forward location and posture creates unique opportunities to build on our existing relationships with our allies and partners. I will tell you, they are feeling the heat and they are all in. We are doing things that are unprecedented that we couldn't even talk about as recently as a couple of years ago. We are working daily with the fleet as part of the Joint Force in 3 MEF to solidify habitual partnerships and burn in coordination processes to leverage the strengths and capabilities of our combined forces. Every exercise, every operation, every activity and investment with our allies and partners is a purposeful competition operation that we walk back and rehearses a specific part of a specific plan. We don't do round robins. We operate with the specific units of a designated ally and partner that we will stand in with. There is no patrolling just to patrol. We don't have the time to do that. But I'll say the progress has been real, but we still have a long way to go. True joint and combined interoperability requires hard work and repetition. In alignment with Indo-PACOM and PAC Fleet, 3 MEF continues to prioritize the synchronization of our command and control processes and networks to deliver timely all-domain effects. That's certainly centered around fires. But I'll also say, I think preaching to the choir here a little bit, the conversation cannot end with fires. In a future conflict against a very capable adversary like China, and I could not agree more, they are not 10 feet tall. Our success is going to continue to depend on our ability to combine arms and effects across multiple domains. Admiral Aquilino likes to say, operationally relevant at speed. I will also, we didn't coordinate our comments beforehand, and I'm very glad there's alignment. I would expect nothing less. Like General Smith, I'll make some comments in closing on the challenges of mobility and joint logistics. As with the larger joint force, our critical vulnerability is our ability to maneuver, move, and sustain ourselves within the weapons engagement zone, even as area denial is a critical Chinese capability. ACMAC talked a little bit this morning about some of the stop gaps we're putting in place, bridging solutions as we work out to the delivery of more purpose-built naval mobility assets. But the challenge of the Western Pacific in a future competition where very likely the adversary will own the starting pistol, this places such a premium on how we leverage our positional advantage and posture our forces forward during critical operational windows. That's not as hard as it seems. We're all looking at the same map sheet as the adversary and our allies and partners and the joint force. We know where the critical terrain is. We know the weather and climatological factors that narrow us down to critical operational windows. We are reworking our TEEP, and the timing and placement of our critical exercises and operations, as General Smith mentioned, so we're there in a three-point stance at the most critical time, which ultimately we hope when she looks out his window is going to cause him to say today is not that day. We're working within the service, Joint Force allies and partners to develop and build out existing logistics networks and infrastructure. And I will end in particular by talking again to the criticality of pre-positioning critical classes of supply. That's an operational imperative. We're getting after that. Besides meeting the imperatives, the requirements of operations and conflict, logistically setting the theater, that is real deterrence. If an adversary sees you with the determination, the gritty wherewithal to lay down your logistics footprint and prepare for a conflict like that, that gives him pause. I promise you that fact is not lost on the Chinese, particularly in light of our efforts to set conditions in the Ukraine following the first Russian invasion in 2014. And then like a Marine, I can't say it any better than General Smith said it, at the end of the day, our ultimate asymmetric advantage is our people. When I was the commanding general of Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego a few years ago, General Dunford came and talked to us, and in very succinct, focused fashion, he laid out the challenges facing the country, our service, the naval service, and he just ended by saying, all things considered, if we get the people part of this right, we're going to be fine. And I will say with apologies to that great Marine, quoting him, if we get the people part of this right, we're going to be fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Chip. Appreciate it. Vice Admiral Thiessen.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let me start off by saying Admiral Swift described my job as the Pacific area. I like to talk about it in terms of my area responsibility. It runs from polar bears to penguins, from Hollywood to Bollywood, and a little bit beyond. So you heard everybody to the right of me right here, you heard about what the Coast Guard does in terms of contributions. I hope to go ahead and elaborate on that. But Admiral Swift, thank you very much. Thank you to AFCEA and to the Naval Institute for an invite to this panel, especially with my distinguished colleagues up here. It's an honor for me to be up here and represent the United States Coast Guard. I just returned from 2 weeks in, I know, tough, right? I was in Australia and New Zealand for 2 weeks. But I was talking with all of my counterparts, all of the navies from both countries, the border force from both countries, and I heard an increasing demand everywhere I went. And that demand was for more United States Coast Guard. Again, emphasizing the fact that your Coast Guard is indeed a global service, operating on and around all 7 continents, and we're around the world largely because of the wide range of missions and the broad authorities that we have. We're postured to serve as an interoperable military service and as a whole of government integrator. While my eyes are wide open, I'm not going to speak in terms of strategic competition. By our nature, the United States Coast Guard has been doing integrated deterrence for over 232 years. But I like to focus on integrated partnerships. The vast majority of our service missions, while military and interoperable with the joint force, are de-escalatory on that continuum of cooperate, compete, and conflict. The gray zone is squarely in our wheelhouse. So, as a commander of Pacific area, I focus on upholding our way of life, founded in a rules-based order, using these wide range of missions, these broad authorities, and our expertise of doing them for about 232 years. We protect, we defend, we save those who live and work on the sea, we protect the sea itself, and we support the rule of law. The Coast Guard's value proposition in all of this is very simple. It is maritime governance. We are a pragmatic service with a humanitarian ethos. We do not target specific actors. Rather, we are after malign behaviors and malign activities. The U.S. Coast Guard pairs well with many of the world navies, both in size and purpose. And our goal is pretty simple. It's to become a trusted partner. The U.S. Coast Guard is a key component of the White House's Indo-Pacific strategy, which specifically calls out the Coast Guard, our role in advising and training like-minded partners with shared values. While the current White House strategy emphasizes the Indo-Pacific's prominent role in national security, the U.S. Coast Guard is not conducting any new missions. We are simply doing more of them in the region and seeking to complete our missions in new and better ways. As our Commandant, Admiral Linda Fagan, likes to say, this is people business. It's much more than ships and aircraft. For us, we've heard it a bunch of times already, it's about expeditionary logistics or expeditionary operations, and my mantra has been, we need places for the Coast Guard vessels, not bases. It's also about small groups of personnel conducting search and rescue, emergency management, law enforcement, marine environmental response, maritime domain awareness, and cyber in subject matter expert exchanges with our partner nations. And believe me, these small groups have a great impact on those nations. Many of our partners in our area of responsibility think of threats and challenges facing them as existential. The Coast Guard strives to meet them where they are and with what they need, seeing these threats and challenges through their eyes. As a service, we have been present in the Indo-Pacific for many, many decades. Any recent expansion of our presence reflects only a renewed commitment to be that dependable and trusted partner. Today, I hope to speak to you about the unique ways that the United States Coast Guard contributes to these national efforts in the Indo-Pacific, combining enduring or persistent presence with niche missions and niche authorities. These include 11 bilateral law enforcement agreements we have with Pacific Island countries. It includes the several multilateral groups that the Coast Guard either leads or participates in. And right now, as mentioned earlier, it includes the Coast Guard cutters that are flying our flag off of Japan, as well as in the Antarctic, in the Bering Sea, and certainly in the Eastern Pacific. And I can't forget it. It's the COSIs that are living and working in places like Japan, South Korea, Australia, China, Singapore, the Philippines, and Vietnam, working to share information and model professional behaviors with our partners. I couldn't be more excited about the U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Area's role in making our nation safer, more secure, and more prosperous. It's a privilege for me to be part of this effort. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and answering any questions you may have. Semper Paratus.
Hey, thanks so much. I just ran across an article this morning where Vice Admiral Tianson's counterpart in the Atlantic was actually on a panel with Vice Admiral Dwyer, who's going to speak in a moment, talking about the Arctic. And so I was sharing the news piece with Vice Admiral Tianson, talking about how his counterpart was saying there was a Coast Guard cutter operating up in the Arctic and ran across a combined surface action group of PLAN and Russian ships. And I told him, I said, I couldn't quite figure it out because, I can get the Russians being up there, but PRC operates in the Atlantic from time to time. And he said, it wasn't up in the Atlantic. Those are my ships, and it was up in my part of the Arctic. But it's a great example of the Coast Guard and Navy working together, that it would be Admiral Dwyer's Second Fleet commander on a panel with a Coast Guard commander talking about some of the integrated defense, integrated deterrence that Admiral Paparo was speaking of earlier. So those are over to you for your comments.
Well, thank you, Admiral Swift. It's a real pleasure to be back here for a second year in a row at West And thank you for that introduction and lead-in. Absolutely, I see the partnership that the U.S. Second Fleet has with the U.S. Coast Guard in the Arctic is very pertinent to this panel. And I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts on that topic here this afternoon. First off, it's great to see so many mentors and shipmates in the crowd here today. And I know each of them are going to go real easy on me throughout the day, and they know me well enough to raise a flag if I get a little bit out of bounds. But it's great to have you here today and see you all present. So beginning in 2012, the Atlantic was an area of relative calm. And then after, our nation was focused on the global war of terrorism, our Navy in particular would rebalance resources and towards that mission. And part of that was the disestablishment of the U.S. Second Fleet in 2011 to rebalance those resources to where our nation needs them towards that global fight on terrorism. But in that vacuum that developed, we saw a rise in a persistent proximate threat in the Atlantic with the reemergence of the Russian undersea forces, showing that the geography no longer provides us a buffer to our security. So in 2018, the U.S. Second Fleet was reestablished, and reestablished with the legacy AOR that it had enjoyed prior to its disestablishment, which stretched from Puerto Rico to the North Pole, from the east coast of the United States to the middle Atlantic at the 45 West parallel. But Second Fleet was brought back and reimagined. And reimagined is not just a static fleet headquarters that would just patrol a particular area of the Atlantic, but as a maneuver arm, able to respond at point of need, both supporting Naval Forces North, currently commanded by Admiral Darrell Cottle, or supporting Naval Forces Europe, currently commanded by Admiral Stu Munch. And so the ability to move across the Atlantic, to knock down that barrier at 45 West and respond to a point of need from the Caribbean to the Arctic. And at the same time, NATO was reassessing its security environment, which was focused largely on out-of-area operations in Afghanistan and Northern Africa and in Iraq and in the Balkans, and reassessing that NATO needed to return to 360 degrees collective defense, because NATO is a defensive alliance focused on the defense of all 30 NATO nations. And as NATO looked at the transatlantic link and the security that this new persistent proximate threat in the Atlantic posed to that transatlantic security, NATO realized that force structure was needed. So in 2018, Joint Force Command Norfolk was established to oversee all operations for NATO in the Atlantic. And so the Joint Force Command Norfolk was dual-hatted with the commander of U.S. Second Fleet. So on one hand, I support NAV North in my naval mission to secure the approaches to the continental United States through the Atlantic, as well as reporting to the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, General Chris Cavoli, in ensuring that the transatlantic is secured for NATO. So as I was invited to speak on this panel with title PRC as a Pacing Threat, what are our opportunities and challenges? Well, clearly, when looking at China from a lens of the U.S. Second Fleet and from NATO, it shows that as we think of China, we have to think globally. And for me, in my job as U.S. Second Fleet and Joint Force Command Norfolk, that's the Arctic. And as you may be aware of, in 2018, China made verbally known to the world its ambitions in the Arctic, publishing their own white paper saying that China was a near Arctic nation and that they had ambitions of expanding their polar Silk Road through the Arctic. And when you look at the North Sea route with the impacts of climate change and the opening of the North Sea route, a route that would cut down transit times from China to Europe by 40% when compared to traversing through the Suez Canal, it has economic and strategic implications for China. But you can't talk PRC in the Arctic without first talking about Russia. And Russia, as many of you know, is one of the 8 Arctic nations. Russia enjoys the largest coastline in the Arctic, and Russia has decades of experience, if not centuries of experience, operating in the Arctic. Just prior to the Beijing Olympics in 2022, Chairman Xi met with President Putin and had that summit that we're all well aware of. And out of that summit, they declared that their relationship would go forward without limits. And without a doubt, part of that discussion was the support of China ambitions in the Arctic. Russia's maritime strategy prior to the summer of 2022 focused primarily on the North Atlantic. Their number one priority was the GI-UK gap and the North Atlantic, and they saw that as their number one strategic imperative for their maritime strategy. In July of last year, in 2022, Russia republished their new maritime strategy, placing the Atlantic and the GI-UK gap as number 3 in priority, where the Arctic was now their first priority. And so with that Russian maritime strategy, we saw an opening of over 100 former Soviet bases to include deep water ports and airfields, the weaponization of the North Sea route, establishing new requirements for transit through the North Sea route by military vessels, and the expansion of the world's largest icebreaker fleet, which currently numbers nearly 50, and over a dozen of those are nuclear powered. Showing Russia has Arctic capability, just last December, in the dead of winter, Russia transferred from their LNG port in Yamal, which is in the Kara Sea, one of their LNG tankers traversed through the North Sea route to Tangshan, China, which is in the Yellow Sea. That trip took that vessel 20 days, and it had transferred 170 cubic meters of liquid natural gas, which equates to about over 1 million barrels of liquid natural gas. That trip, if they would have gone through the Suez Canal, would have taken anywhere from 40 to 50 days. And they made the trip in the dead of winter in an icebound North Sea route in trail of one of their nuclear-powered icebreakers in just 20 days, showing the importance of the North Sea route and the ability to move goods and services globally. Now, pre-Ukraine invasion, Russia and China embarked on a joint venture to develop a Chinese liquid natural gas terminal in the Arctic. And PRC sees opportunity in the Arctic only through Russia. When they look at the strategic choke points of the Straits of Malacca and the Sunda Strait and what denied access of those choke points would mean for China's economy, the North Sea route has strategic implications for the PRC. So no doubt that they're looking for opportunity with Russia in the Arctic. We also see PRC mapping the Arctic with their 2 Arctic research vessels. And they've also embarked on their own icebreaking capability, currently on contract to build an icebreaker of nearly 40 tons, potentially nuclear powered, and without a doubt, based on some of the technical specifications in that contract, to be armed with some force of either self-protect or offensive capability. All this for this near Arctic nation. Why build an icebreaker if you do not have intentions in the Arctic? So when we look at opportunities and challenges that we can face with the PRC in the Arctic, first and foremost, presence matters. We have to be present in the Arctic, and we have to develop our own capabilities so we can operate in such a harsh environment. The White House published their 2022 Arctic strategy just last fall, and in that strategy they had 4 pillars. First was security, second, climate change, third, economic development, and fourth, partnerships. At home, partnerships with the United States Coast Guard in the Arctic, who has capability of their own with 2 of our indigenous icebreakers, as well as with our NATO allies and partners. As I mentioned, Russia is one of 8 Arctic nations. With the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, 7 of the 8 Arctic nations will be NATO nations. So we have opportunity with our NATO allies in the Arctic. From an operations, investments, and activity standpoint, participation in Arctic exercise like Operation Nanook, Cold Response, Nordic Response, and Nordic Viking with our allies and partners pays dividends in operating in the Arctic. We also need to look at our investments in high-altitude communications. Broadband communications above 65 north are critical for us to expand and be able to compete with China in the Arctic. As mentioned by many of the panel members up here, logistics matters, and logistics in the Arctic is a challenge with very remote and inhospitable locations. Determining logistics basing for all the various classes of supply in the Arctic will be a challenge, and we need to look at that. And then Arctic access. How do we as a nation access the Arctic in the winter? With the North Sea route ice-free only in the months of August and September, the ability to compete in the high north is critical in our ability to gain access into that environment. So as we look at opportunities and challenges with the PRC, we cannot lose sight of it's not just inside the first and second island chain, it's globally, and we have to include Arctic in that conversation. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Dozer. Vice Admiral Clapperton?
Thanks, Admiral Smith, and appreciate very much, Admiral Smart, sorry, and appreciate the opportunity very much to be up here with these the warriors on this panel, these exceptional leaders, and I'm very proud of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and civilians that provide each of these gentlemen's commands and their warfighters with 3 critical warfighting capabilities, being Assured C2 and NC3, battle space and space domain awareness to enable them to sense, see, and understand the battle space, and if necessary, deliver long-range precision fires, and then space, cyber, and EW capabilities to enable their warfighting. I want to just sort of level set. As the 10th Fleet Commander, I am my own boss as the Fleet Cyber Commander. I am also the commander of Joint Force Headquarters Cyber Navy, and work very closely with the commander of MARFOR Cyber that provides obviously a great deal of the cyber capabilities to the 2 MEF commanders and to the Coast Guard Cyber Commander who provides a great deal of the support to Andy's team, and I work very closely with both of them across the Indo-Pacific in support of efforts in U.S. Forces Korea and then also in South America. And then also, additionally, the commander of Navy Space. Navy Space stood up officially on 1 January of this year, and pending confirmation from the Senate, I will be designated the 3-star commander of Navy Space. So under those four commands, like I said, we focus on really 3 warfighting capabilities that we deliver to the fleet. But make sure you understand the authorities under which we operate. So as the Fleet Cyber Commander and the Joint Force Headquarters Cyber Navy Commander, I am co-com to U.S. Cyber Command and General Nakasone. And so that's where I derive my authorities for offensive and defensive cyber, both under Title 10 and Title 50 authorities. And then as the U.S. Navy Space Commander, co-com to General Dickinson and U.S. Space Command. And so a service component commander there, but provides space capabilities to SpaceCom for global support in the warfight. And then under 10th Fleet is where we provide those 3 warfighting capabilities globally to the Navy. So going through each of those in just a little bit more detail. Assured C2 and NC3. So not only can't you fight if you can't command and control, if you can't communicate, but I also think they're critical to the integrated deterrence challenges that we face. As our adversaries every day engage and try to penetrate the DODN, try to disrupt our data links, try to penetrate our logistics, communications, and support links, and they recognize and understand and see how hardened they are, see the level of resiliency that they provide, and see how they can provide the warfighting commanders to execute their mission. That is a deterrent effect when they recognize the capabilities of the U.S. forces. And it's a critical one that we provide globally to the Navy, and then specifically in the joint fight for the Indo-PACOM, U.S. Forces Korea, and Southcom AORs. Battle space, space domain awareness that enables them to sense and understand the battle space and deliver long-range precision fires. Right now, about 85% of how we enable and understand long-range precision fires is through SIGINT. And those SIGINT collection capabilities are from my NIAC commanders, my task force commanders globally, that also rely on tactical edge capabilities and collection from our ships, our airplanes, and our submarines. And they focus, collate, and build that picture that enables the 3-star and 4-star commands to execute their mission. Specifically, we provide long-range precision fires for not only PAC Fleet, but for Admiral Aquilino in the Indo-PACOM theater, for General LaCamera and U.S. Forces Korea, and then, if necessary, to General Richardson down in the Southcom AOR. Globally, I provide that to the Navy, but then it's also a Navy capability, the Navy Integrated Fires Element, or KNIFE, that enables us to provide target quality data globally to forces as they need it. That includes into the European AOR, where we work very closely with Admiral Munch and his team, providing them critical battle space, space domain awareness, and long-range precision fires targeting that they share with our European partners and with Ukraine when appropriate. And then space, cyber, and electronic warfare capabilities. So obviously, as Joint Force Headquarters Cyber Navy and Fleet Cyber, I derive all the offensive and defensive cyber authorities that I need as Navy Space, the space capabilities, but it's also through one of my task forces, Task Force 1090, also known as Navy Cyber Warfare Development Group, or NICWIG, where we provide some exquisite electronic warfare collection and electronic warfare jamming capabilities. Again, not just to the Navy, but globally to the joint fight as well. We execute those 3 warfighting capabilities across our 5 strategic priorities that are warfighting, readiness, integration, innovation, and partnerships. That readiness challenge is definitely, I would say, our most significant one. And many of my colleagues have already talked about the challenges of talent management, accessions, retention, and recruitment of the right workforce to do that. And certainly in the cyber and EW and space world, that is a significant challenge. We're both the military, the intelligence community, and then as well as the civilian workforce, we're all sort of fishing from the same pond. There are times and in some skill sets where that pond is not very deep, and so retaining our nation's best to execute our mission is critical. We're in the cyber and in space game, we are engaged and face-to-face with the enemy every single day. They try to penetrate our networks. They try to gain advantage. They try to deny us the ability to provide assured C2 battle space awareness and long-range precision fires to the joint force. And being ready to enable the warfighter and execute our warfighting capabilities is where we focus 24/7 across my 4 commands. And I look forward to your questions today. Thanks again, Admiral Smart.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Craig. Appreciate it very much. So looking at the time and the detail that these commanders went into talking about both challenges and opportunities that they have, what I'd like to do is to transition to the Q&A piece. We're actually about 5 minutes early to do that, but I'm betting that the wealth of questions out there is going to be more powerful than us talking amongst ourselves. So who is the first one that has the courage to step to the microphone here? And there's plenty that we can talk about amongst ourselves up here if the question well runs dry.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thanks to the panel and Admiral for being here. Rear Admiral retired Mike Mann. When I think about the Chinese challenge, I think about the greatest challenge being a mining and submarine campaign that isolates the island of Taiwan and slowly strangles it. I don't think of an invasion. I think, why would you invade or or bombard Taiwan, what's the value of the island after you destroyed it? And when I think about our opportunities, I think about the opportunity of bottling up China inside the first island chain and slowly doing the same thing to them. Could anyone on the panel comment on what you think is right or wrong about what I just said?
Yeah, KT, I mean, there's a lot that you can't talk about, but take a pause and maybe you can share some insights that you can share. And then I would open up for the rest of the panelists that if they have thoughts to add. We had Admiral Paparo got a question about mining on the west coast of the United States, and I immediately thought of Vice Admiral Tianson and the challenges that he's got looking after the coast as a homeland defense piece. But KT.
Yeah, Admiral Monahan, thanks for the question. So I think I'll take your second comment first, because I think it speaks the best to the team that's up here. And you've heard an awful lot about the inside force and that first island chain and how important it is, and bottling up the PRC, as you stated. We look very closely at that geography, and it does have some choke points, and it's important for us to control those choke points and to be able to own that battle space. And so that defining line that runs down from South Korea through Japan, down through the Philippines, is an important line. And our desire is to be able to have that free to maneuver outside of it. I mean, we talked about logistics an awful lot today, and to be able to maneuver outside in the Philippine Sea and to be able to get resupply where we need it is important. And the ability to ensure they stay inside the first island chain and be able to create the effects that we want to create inside there is also important. And that gets to the long-range fires, the inside fires, the asymmetric capabilities that we are working on, the submarines where we own a tremendous advantage. And you mentioned mining in the first half, something that we certainly are looking at. That's a very asymmetric capability in its own, and it works on both sides. And so that's the way we look at the picture as well in the battle space, and I'll turn it over to some of my teammates here to talk about it from their perspective.
Chip?
Hey, sir, thanks for the question. I'll agree with all your points. We have seen, particularly over the last year, a concerted effort by the PRC to increasingly add operational depth to their efforts to operate east of Taiwan. We saw that during the speaker's visit. We saw that kind of surge effort during December, to create a normal where they have a pseudo de facto air and sea blockade of Taiwan. And I will just say we are pushing back. We continually exercise, rehearse, and operate with a focus on controlling and dominating the decisive space on the shoulders of Taiwan. That is the Southwest Islands. I heard a Japanese officer refer to that as the stepping stone, the string of pearls that leads to Taiwan, the Ryukyus, and that is Luzon. But our ability to be postured forward as a joint force, as a combined force, to be on that terrain and to leverage and create effects from that space, I think that is a tremendous offsetting capability to what they're trying to do. Thanks.
So, Andy, we talk a lot about mining and countermine operations from a naval force perspective. Any thoughts from a Coast Guard perspective? Is that part of your mission set from a Homeland Defense perspective?
Thanks for pushing that over here. I don't want to go right there right now, but what I was thinking about when Admiral Paparo was talking about, and Craig, you'll thank me for this, but I was thinking of cyber.
Yeah.
And the issue with cyber, from my perspective, because not only do I have those international responsibilities, I also have very close domestic responsibilities. Think of things like the port of LALB and how important that is to our economy and our prosperity. And I look at that and I say, wow, cyber is a real threat. It doesn't take too far to see that. Think about all the cranes that work all of those containers, and where are those things made, and where does the software come from, And where does the information go with all those things? Anyways, long story short with that is, I'm worried about that cyber piece. I'm concerned about it. We do have cyber protection teams that are working closely with various ports, but that's our commercial ports. What about where we have things that we do, time phase deployments from, in ports like that, where you need to upload equipments and all of those? What are those cranes? What is happening there? So I'd offer this. Admiral Paparo talked about mines, and he said that he didn't see that as being an issue too much. I guess from my perspective, I would second what Admiral Paparo was saying. I would be more concerned about cyber, and I know that through this connection already that Craig talked about with U.S. Coast Guard cyber and DoD cyber, we have a little bit more authority that we can get to different places and look at things, right? Through our port security authorities as well as our international port security type of authorities. So we are doing that not only within the theater, but also here at home. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to the cyber piece.
Oh, well, first I'll acknowledge I called Admiral Swift the wrong name twice like a jackass, but I'll just acknowledge that. But I apologize for that, sir.
I've been called worse.
Smart, right?
Yeah, exactly. But no, so let me, on the cyber piece, I think, Andy brings up a good point. The Coast Guard provides some really unique authorities that we don't have within Cyber Command. A lot of times, while Cyber Command does have the responsibility to defend the nation against cyber attack, a lot of it comes down to capacity. And we certainly don't have current authorities to go into private and civilian or state companies, organizations, or even critical infrastructure and tell them how we think they ought to do their business. We certainly work very closely with FBI, with DHS, with CISA, with the NSA to provide them insights, adversary targeting, and how we think they should defend themselves. But really, ultimately, in those cases, it comes down to them taking the appropriate actions for your organizations to take the appropriate actions within the DIB to make sure that you are protected. And I guarantee you, if you can hear me talking right now, the companies you work for are targeted. I can assure you that. So we have to work very closely with partners, DIB, state, national, within the Coast Guard as well to try to help and enable those folks. We have to, for us to actually be able to provide direct support requires a DISCA request, but it's certainly an area where we have significant concerns, and it's not just the ports. It's really anything that is defense critical infrastructure that enables our military forces. So you got to think power, you got to think water, you got to think cooling. All those are areas where we have concern and where we need to work very closely with the whole of government and with our civilian and DIB partners to protect ourselves.
So I'd go back to one of my opening comments about these gentlemen are leading, planning, and operating at the tactical edge. And so the mine warfare piece is critically important, but the world has changed. You just can't think of a blockade operation in the context of traditional mining. You got to think of it of cyber mining, cyber effects, physical mining. I think where we are in the mine warfare business, we could be much further down that path if we applied ourselves intellectually the way these gentlemen are doing day in and day out. Yes, sir.
Craig Madsen, retired Navy captain and current employee at NAVWAR. We've had recent wartime experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, and are currently doing a lot of supporting work in Ukraine. And all of those we're working with joint forces, with allies, with partners. What are the lessons learned or takeaways that will remain the same in a fight with China over Taiwan? And what is different that we need to prepare for?
I can probably take it.
You want to go ahead, Hans?
I think I'll take a crack at that. I think what's the same is that it's going to require, more so than in those other operations, joint, synchronized effects. And so to the previous question, mining, yes. Special forces, yes. Submarines, yes. We need to do all of those things in a synchronized manner. I like Chip's comment about the Marines, submarines and Marines being the stand-in force, but the reality is the entire joint force is the stand-in force. And we're going to do that by synchronizing our efforts underneath an umbrella built by Clapperton, using the space and cyber effects that might be available to build us sanctuaries where we can operate in the stand-in. We've all seen the maps with big red lines that show us backing further and further and further out of the AOR. That's not how we're going to fight. We're a joint stand-in force, and we have to plan together and employ together, and then have command and feedback loops that allow us to adjust the joint effects so that we get the best out of the joint force. You know, World War II, split up. MacArthur, you got this. Nimitz, you got this. This is figuring out what the best effect is for the target we're trying to go after. That may be space, cyber, information operations, subsurface, surface, air. We don't know, but we are all the stand-in force when it comes to defending Taiwan, which the Taiwan Relations Act compels us to do. So whether or not we should do that or will do that or will have the authorities to do it, to us doesn't matter. We are tasked to be able to do it.
George?
Yeah, I would just offer, with the examples that you provided, what strikes me is the common denominator of the information space. So you can have all the tactical successes you want, and we certainly had a bunch of them in the examples you gave, and Ukraine is yet another example. But if you're not winning in the information space, you're not winning. And so I see that as a common denominator going forward in a China-Taiwan scenario as well.
Vice Admiral Dwyer.
Yeah, so from my vantage, watching very closely the war in Ukraine right now, the one lesson learned that we really need to take on board any future conflict in the Pacific is the speed of information sharing. As we watch the buildup of the Russian ground forces on the border of Ukraine, and then how quickly we turn that intel to some of our allies and even our partners that weren't NATO allies, how with the speed. I was reading some of this intel in my daily TS book, and the very next day it was an open source reporting. I mean, just the speed we declassified and elevated that to share with our, and that brought a tremendous amount of credibility to the U.S. government and the DoD, and built a lot of goodwill and mustered the overwhelming support and speed of support we saw with NATO to respond to that invasion. And it was because of the quickness that we turned that intel around. We just deployed the Gerald R. Ford last fall on its first deployment, and in that deployment, she sailed with 8 ships from our NATO allies and partners. And the only way we were able to do that is through the information sharing systems that we put on Ford to allow us to communicate with our allies and partner in near real time. So much so that I embarked my staff foreign area officer, my FAO, on board the Gerald R. Ford to be able to coordinate our activities. So we cannot discount information sharing agreements, the speed, and then the way we transmit that information. And so it's timely and relevant to our allies and partners. I know KT's looking at that really hard in 7th Fleet and how we work through that, because he's got issues with how we share information and the penetration some of our allies' networks may or may not have, and there's some concerns there. So I think that is, the number one lesson learned from Ukraine that we need to take forward in a future conflict.
Hey, just a couple of comments listening to these gentlemen. Some of it isn't exactly to your question, but I think the work that you are doing professionally is critically important to the force. I mean, you're building the tools that Admiral Clapperton down there is applying to build this maneuver space, both physical and cyberspace, for us to maneuver in. I made a comment, so I'm retired now, so I work with a bunch of retired folks, most of them who I knew before, and I got to give a shout out to Hawk Carlisle on this, because this is a discussion that he and I were having, and I said, hey, we need to get to the point of transmitting data to weapons. It's not sensor to shooter anymore. That is too slow, and it's way behind our technological ability to get to. And so we were talking about 2 weeks later, and as if you know Hawk, as only Hawk can diminish a naval officer in public, Hawk's a good friend. he made the comment to me that he said, I don't think you have it right with data to weapon. He goes, I think what we need to get to is data to effect. That's what's critical. That's what Admiral Boyle is talking about, the joint force. So we've got our naval systems. You're a part of it. We need to think much more broadly than that. And then just two other points that triggered in my mind, and it goes to both Admiral Dwyer's comments and Admiral Clapperton's comments. We're stuck on this need to know piece, and now we've got a requirement to share. And it took the White House to lean forward and lift the policy pieces that allowed us to share the information that was critical, certainly in the opening days of that conflict. And then going in a completely different way, what the Brits did with Queen Elizabeth II and her deployment, with Marines F-35 embarked, with incredible classified capability, and then shifting country ships in and out of that formation based on that country's comfort level at where Queen Elizabeth II was operating. We can do this. These gentlemen do it every day with a constellation of partners who have real national restrictions about what they can or can't do. I mean, you heard what's happening in the South China Sea now, and things are going to happen in the near future. So thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Diego Laje with Signal Magazine. I have a quick question and then my real question. Just a quick follow-up is, which resources, logistics, assets would you like to be able to deploy in Taiwan now? And then I have a real question, which is, could you please address the Antarctic? Because we're talking about the Arctic, and China is investing heavily and placing lots of efforts into having an Antarctic presence.
I can't wait to hear who is going to answer that first question.
You know, I'll answer that more generally. I probably won't talk specifically to Taiwan. You heard General Smith, if you were at his terrific comments this morning, talk about the fact that we want to logistically set the theater and put ourselves in a position to where if we have to rapidly deploy, we are just carrying lethality forward. You know, no surprise with a lot of the great countries we're working with. There are a lot of political considerations, you know, second and third order effects to pre-positioning, but I think there's some middle space that we can agree on. One of the things that my logistics planners have remind me of is, you know, sir, in a sustained fight, 20% of the logistics throughput is water. So, you know, as we have conversations with allies and partners, you know, hard to find things like maybe water, fuel, food, medical supplies, much less objectionable, you know, potential uses in a humanitarian situation, but also anything that's in place that lessens our dispersal requirements, our throughput sustainment requirements, you know, so then we can focus on the Class 5, the ammunition, some of the more critical things, the equipment, when we have to deploy forward over time and space. It's all good, it's additive, and at the risk of repeating myself, what a message that sends to an adversary that you're not messing around. Thanks.
Admiral, I think also when you talk Taiwan specifically, as these gentlemen have said, we need to have the ability to share information with Taiwan. And so I want to make sure that we have a secure method, a resilient method to share information, to share data, and to share intelligence with Taiwan, and make sure that they can do the same for us. If we're going to be involved in that defense, then they have to be a full partner, and therefore we've got to be able to communicate.
I'll just add that in the Taiwan Relations Act, I talked to the that we're compelled to come to their defense or be prepared to. Not that we necessarily will, but we're also, it also talks to providing the capability for them to defend themselves. So not only should we be prepared from a, what do we forward deploy for our own capability and logistics efficiency, but what do we provide to them? And I think as I walk around the floor here, there are a lot of asymmetric capabilities that could be specifically targeted at them coming to their own defense.
KT?
The only thing I would also add to it is when you talked about resources, I was going to say people and training. You know, the reality is that Taiwan is a wealthy country. We've seen a lot of great effects that happen in Ukraine because of the people and the hardness of those folks in Ukraine and what they've brought to the fight. And, you know, our ability to share and train and to ensure that the average Taiwanese citizen has that same level of skill, that's the resource, and I think is the most that we should leverage for the Taiwanese
Thanks,
people.
KT. Andy, did you have a?
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. I love your question. Thanks a lot, right? I said polar bears to penguins earlier, so you nabbed me. High latitudes. I think in terms of the high latitudes, when I think of those, I think, wow. It's very simple. I think Dan mentioned earlier that the Russians have about 45 icebreakers. They have about a dozen of those, nuclear powered. The Chinese are right up there, right? He mentioned them being a near Arctic nation. So I know I'm focused Arctic, but it applies to both. These are all in the high lats, right? You know how many we have? I think he mentioned it. Two that they're under, well, my operational control. We sent one up last year. We went up to the North Pole proper with the Coast Guard cutter Healy. Right now we're in plans with the U.S. UCOM, Navy, our Coast Guard Atlantic Fleet folks, in talking about doing a very long trip up there. I think Dan mentioned earlier that presence matters. Particularly, he mentioned in the Arctic, because that's his AOR. I would say presence matters in both of the high lats and the Antarctic. It doesn't take too much to figure out what's going on, right? There's a treaty in the Antarctic. China is also one of the signatories to that. We are as well. In fact, as I'm talking to you, our Polar Star, one of our icebreakers, is down there right now at McMurdo. I just came back from New Zealand because I was at Christchurch, which is kind of like the entryway down to the Antarctic, but it doesn't take too much to figure out what's going on, and all it really takes is to look at the activities of Zhuilong 1, Zhuilong 2, Chinese icebreakers / survey vessels, and other vessels that are down there doing things. So part of me wants to think of areas of large deposits of resources that you can get after and that are helpful to mankind in general. And part of me wants to think of, okay, so what is going on down there that is malign in terms of activity and behaviors? So as I mentioned, we have a Polar Star that's down there right now breaking open to go to McMurdo Station and resupply our U.S. station that's down there. But you nailed it. It's an issue. We need icebreakers. We do have an icebreaking project that's going on to provide 6 new icebreakers, 3 of which would be heavy icebreakers. So when I say that, I think thicker levels of ice. But that icebreaker serves as a way to show our flag in both the Arctic and Antarctic. The other 3 would be a medium, but we needed those yesterday. We're certainly working that way with the administration as well as Congress. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to move into speed round. We got 3 questions that are left here, and if you don't direct your question to an individual on the stage, I will, and that'll be the individual that answers it, and we'll get to these last 3 questions and finish on time. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. This is Captain Rick Easton, Surface Warfare Officer, retired. My question has to do with manpower, personnel education, or more the training part of it. We looked at where we are, and in context of things are eye-wateringly better than they were 20 years ago, whether it be augmented reality, virtual reality, et cetera, and what we can do. But as we look at our peer competitor in China, distributed maritime operations, a typical sinusoidal workup for deployments where we plug all the holes, we get everybody ready to go, and then you certify them. Now we go to war, a hot war. Do we have the right vision for training to support that distributed maritime operation that we're going to have to execute over a fairly long period of time? And do we have the manpower resources flowing in correctly to make sure it works?
So as the warfighters on the stage, I think, Fonz, you have more training than the others do in your portfolio.
Yeah, I think we have the right vision, but I think we have the reality that the environment continues to evolve and change, and so that we can't be stagnant in the way that we think about training and certification. We can't be in the mindset we've always had where we go into a deep bathtub and then come out super ready. We have to look at ways to kind of level that readiness. And one of the ways we're looking to do that is in the LVC environment, the live, virtual, and constructive. So how do I maintain a much higher level of readiness, of training, of understanding my system, of being able to, with the agility to shift to a new AOR and train on the go. And if I can figure out how to put those capabilities in place, then maybe I don't need to spend as much time and go as deep into the bathtub, as we say, back in the earlier parts of the training cycle. So we're continuing to assess and adjust that training for the pacing threat that we have, and based on the new technologies that exist that will allow us to do it more efficiently.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for that. I'm going to save you for last. Go ahead, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Maria Posada with Dawn Operational Energy under ASN RDA and ASN EINE. So our office has been tasked with developing a plan for energy supportability and energy demand reduction, and understanding that we're going towards electrification and hybridization, electrification, biofuels, and other innovative operational energy solutions. What challenges do you see within the acquisition and requirements realm that we can implement in our plan to support your operations?
I didn't hear the question.
Hey, I can tell you an example, recent example of this is, we're doing a lot of work to upgrade the pier space here in Southern California to allow us to ensure that when we pull in, we plug in to a much greener, more efficient energy source, as opposed to running generators that are not very efficient, not very effective, they're not very clean for the environment. So it's a partnership between the Navy, the CNIC, the state, to help us together get to that solution. But we have to have agility. So during the heat wave here last summer, when the state of California ran out of power, they called the Navy and said, hey, any chance you can plug all your ships back in to save us a little bit of power here in the grid? And so 122,000 homes worth of energy were pulled back off the grid and put on diesel generators here in port. So it's not just about how efficient the ships are at sea, but it's how efficient and how clean we operate them throughout the cycle of port, at sea, et cetera.
So I'll just, in the interest of time, we need to move on, but I want to add also from a warfighting perspective, the Navy and Marine Corps are heavily involved in reducing the magnitude of the logistics challenge that we have. All of our logistic lines are long, they're exposed, they're very vulnerable. So the less fuel, I think, Chip, you may have mentioned this about how the Marine approach from an EABO perspective has minimized the logistic requirement of those Marines deployed, living off the land, living off of energy sources. There's some really interesting things that the Marines are doing to generate power needed, as well as to reduce the requirement for power in the forces that they have. Every year I come here, I am amazed at what a challenge it is for me to come participate in West in the energy that it draws from me, and to have you here again asking another question of this group. So what's on your mind?
Well, my question is going to be a little complicated, but I think it's very simple. My direction is going to be for the 7th Fleet and for 3MEF, but I want to bounce off Admiral Boyle here, who said that implied or directed that the United States has some kind of a defensive commitment for Taiwan. That being said, I want to go over to Guadalcanal in the Second World War with the 7th Fleet and 3MEF. The distance between China, we put in 1956-57, we put the 7th Fleet down there to stop China from bombarding the islands off of Taiwan, if we'll all remember back to 1956 and 1957. I know we're all not in that ball game, but that's where I'm starting at. So now the distance between China and Taiwan is shorter than the distance between the Philippines and Taiwan. So my question is how is the 7th Fleet going to support getting 3 MEF to Taiwan, because that's going to be the ultimate objective no matter how we look at it if we're going to defend Taiwan. Somebody's got to go there to help reinforce the Taiwanese in that same way that we are reinforcing the Ukraine ultimately today. So my question is for the 7th Fleet and for 3 MEF to tell me how we're going to get the Marines to Taiwan if that's what's going to happen under what I believe Admiral Boyle said.
Hey, let me just quickly clarify what I did not intend to say if I said it, that the U.S. has a defensive commitment to Taiwan. The U.S. Department of Defense is tasked to be prepared to defend Taiwan if ordered. Slightly nuanced difference.
The question is still a good one. So I think, KT, I
verbalization
think you and
is still
Chip
the
can easily
same.
cover down on this from the things that you're doing, at least what you can share publicly. And I think I'm out of a job at Next West. I think we've got the next moderator for the panel next year.
No, hey, Sergeant Major, always great to see you, and thanks. I can look at, speaking for 3MEF, a number of different plans, not just the China family of plans, where 3MEF has task requirements to deploy on very short notice to decisive key maritime terrain. It's not just Taiwan; it's other specific locations, depending on the threat and our operational responsibilities in the specific plan. If we have to do that, first thing is, as General Smith and I have talked about, and some of the other panelists, ideally, we want to approach our steady state campaign, our TEEP, our exercises and operations, so we're already there at the critical times. If we have to deploy on short notice, I will tell you, it will be a combination of organic capabilities, the 3MEF's own 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. We will, without question, leverage the capabilities of 7th Fleet, depending where they're located. There's nothing like amphibious forces to gain you positional advantage and to be able to rapidly transition ashore. And we're also looking at a number of probably less familiar asymmetric means to get to that key terrain as well. So a combination of air and surface capabilities. We absolutely, I talked about the first 10 moves, plan this in some detail with 7th Fleet, but it will be a combination of organic, joint, and fleet capabilities, and I don't want to leave allies and partners out if we have to get there very rapidly in an evolving crisis.
And Sergeant Major, I'll just add to it. You know, my main pitch when I talked was about allies and partners, and so it is a 3MEF and a 7th Fleet issue, but it's also a Japanese issue and a Philippine issue, and we're all looking at the same problem. It's not easy to cross 75, 80 miles worth of water. It's important that we won't necessarily control the shot clock. If we do our jobs right, we'll deter this situation from ever occurring. Obviously, our job is to prepare. Our job is to plan, to think through it and talk about it. I can't go into the plans in depth, but the fight is against a peer competitor. It's a fight of long-range fires, of sensing and shooting and moving, and working with your allies and partners. And the good thing is, out there in 7th Fleet, I have a great partner in Chip. I have a great partner in everybody up in the stage, but I also have our allies and partners. And all of us are thinking about this very difficult problem and thinking about how we're going to solve it, and it's going to take all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergeant
Hey,
Major.
thanks everyone for hanging here. We're a little bit over, but if anything, the crowds continue to deepen. I'm reminded when I was a 1-star, I worked for a SWO captain, And great, I learned so much from him. And he had some great sayings. One thing he said is, feel free not to be a victim. He also would frequently say, hard is authorized. I don't think you see any victims up here, and you see some people that are working really hard at the problem set that they've been given, the mission functions task. They're not complaining about it. They're getting after it. And they're seizing instability and uncertainty as opportunities. So if you're not leaving here with a sense of confidence that we have the right people, as several people have mentioned up here, focused on the problem, then you weren't listening. Thanks, everyone. And Paul, to you and Pete, just a fantastic event here. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Admiral Swift, and the entire panel for taking some time to be with us here today to talk about this important topic. But more importantly, thank you for giving us your insights on what we, and I mean the royal we, it's us, it's our partners, it's our allies, it's our industry, it's everybody, the royal we, what we need to do to outpace our pacing threat. Thank you very much. And on behalf of AFCEA International and the U.S. Naval Institute, I want to provide you a small token of our appreciation. Is a book, Fire on the Water, by Robert Haddock.